Blizzard-strip shingles were peeling off the barn roof at Willow-Bend Ranch, Montana Territory, on the January night in 1886, when a bank notice would change everything the valley thought it knew about a widow's chances. By winter, the whole valley would owe Cora Hale a debt no ledger at the First Territorial Bank could ever measure, and it would start with $9, 240 acres of half-dead range, and a knock at a door she almost didn't answer. I have gathered a great many ranch stories off this stretch of the territory, and most of them belong to the man who rides in to fix what everyone assumed a woman couldn't manage alone. This is not one of those stories, and I want that understood plainly. Before we go one step further, Cora Hale saved her own ranch. The man who knocked on her door that winter helped her do it, and he is worth knowing in full. His losses were as real as hers, and what grew between them was earned by both. But the hand on the ledger, the hand on the plow line, and the hand that finally beat a land baron in a territorial courtroom belonged to her every single time. Stay with me for both of their stories, hers and his, because you will not understand the second without the first. And I promise you, the ending is worth the whole cold road it takes to reach it. Cora had run Willow-Bend alone for 2 years by the night this story finds her, ever since a spooked gelding threw her husband Daniel in the March mud and left her too far off to reach him in time. She was 26 that winter, chestnut-haired, weathered plain across the knuckles, from work most women in the county were never expected to do. And she had learned to read a bank letter, the way other people read scripture carefully, and braced for the worst line to be the true one. She kept her own books, in her own ledger, in her own hand, because she had watched too many widows in that country hand their affairs to a man who managed the affairs right out from under them before the ink was even dry. She could doctor a breech foal at 4 in the morning with her whole arm inside the mare to the shoulder and not lose either animal. She could ride fence 12 miles in a whiteout and find every down post by feel before the cold found her first. What she could not do that particular January was make 240 acres of failing irrigation grow enough grass fast enough to keep a bank quiet. Laura Ingalls Wilder once wrote that it is a great thing to know what to do with a day, and there were nights, that whole first winter, when knowing what to do with the very next single day was the only rope Cora Hale had left to hold on to. The letter from the First Territorial Bank had sat face down on her kitchen table for 3 days before she could make herself read it a second time. $385 owed the balance, due in full by the 2nd of March, or Willow-Bend would stand for auction on the courthouse steps down in Fort Lyle. She had $9 in the tin behind the flour bin. 22 months of patching fence and mending pumps and turning away every man who came sniffing around her boundary line had come down to $9 in 30 days, and a name, Willow-Bend, that half of Cedar Fork no longer quite believed in. She had turned down 3 separate offers on the land in those 2 years, each one dressed up as neighborly concern, each one from the same big cattleman down the valley who owned more range than any 3 other outfits combined, and had made a study of which widows and homesteaders were close enough to breaking to say yes. The town itself had mostly stopped taking bets on how long she'd last after the second winter, not out of unkindness exactly, but because a woman running 240 acres alone was, in Cedar Fork's plain estimation, simply a fact working itself slowly toward its obvious conclusion. Cora had heard the talk at the mercantile and the church social both, and had learned to let it pass through her the way weather did, without changing her course by an inch. She was standing at that same window when the knock finally came, watching snow drive sideways across a pasture Daniel had fenced with his own 2 hands the spring before he died. She was not watching because she expected the weather to improve. She was watching because sitting back down at that table and reading the bank notice a 3rd time felt like something that might break loose inside her chest and never quite settle back into place. The knock itself was 3 solid raps, the unhurried kind that meant whoever stood on the porch had already decided to keep standing there until somebody let them in. Cora set the letter face down, shrugged her coat on over her house dress, and cracked the door only as far as her own boot wedged against the bottom panel would allow, a habit Daniel had drilled into her years before. "Don't open all the way," he used to say, "until you know exactly what you're opening to." The man on the porch was tall and road-worn, a little girl asleep against his shoulder wrapped in a coat 3 sizes too big for her, a boy of 9 standing half-hidden behind him, studying Cora's boots instead of her face. His name was Levi Dawson, he explained, and the children were his daughter Wren and his son Sam, and he wouldn't have troubled a stranger's door except that the children needed to get warm. And if there was any milk to spare for the girl, he'd be more grateful than he knew how to say plainly. His eyes were gray in the particular way of a color that had once run warmer and hadn't fully recovered. Cora studied him 3 long seconds. Any weapons on him? She wanted to know. A skinning knife on his belt he allowed, and a rifle out in the wagon, and both would stay exactly where they were. She looked past him toward the dark shape of that wagon down at her fence line, one horse standing with its head low, worn through the same long cold he was. She stepped back and let the door swing wide. She fed Sam broth first, because he was working the hardest of anyone in that kitchen not to look hungry, and warmed a cup of milk for Wren at the stove, testing it against her own wrist the way she would have for an infant. The girl was running a fever, mild but real. Levi laid it all out plainly while the children ate, without once fishing for pity. His wife Mara had died of a fever the September before. The homestead they'd built together over in Larkspur County was lost that same hard season, and he'd been looking for honest work of any kind ever since. Something in Cora's own better judgment lost an argument with itself, and she found herself asking whether he knew the first thing about irrigation. "Depends entirely on the system," he granted, careful not to promise more than he could prove. Hers was failing badly, channels bleeding water before it ever reached half the south pasture, and 2 paid men who'd each warned her the whole thing needed tearing out and rebuilt at a price she simply didn't have. Levi posed careful, specific questions about grade and soil and the age of the ditch lines, and by the time he finished with them, Cora had the strange, steadying sense that both those men had been selling her repair to a problem that didn't actually exist. They had been 3 weeks on the road by then, sleeping in the wagon bed under whatever cover the weather allowed, ever since the last of Levi's money ran out paying a doctor in a town too small to remember the name of, back when Wren's fever had first come on. He did not tell Cora that part that first night, not fully. Only that Larkspur County had cost him everything a man could lose short of his own 2 children, his homestead, his standing, and the woman he'd built both of those things beside. What he carried, instead of complaint, was a kind of careful, watchful competence, the manner of a man who had learned the hard way that the world did not owe him softness, and had decided the only honest answer to that was to make himself useful wherever he landed, plainly, and without asking anyone's pity for the effort. There was a room off the back of the barn with a stove in it, she explained. He and the children could stay the night. Come morning, he'd walk her channels and tell her plainly what he actually found, and they'd talk about the shape of any work arrangement after that. 30 days. That was the whole of it. The number that sat under everything that followed like a stone lodged behind Cora's ribs, and Levi never once made her feel foolish for carrying it. When she finally voiced the deadline out loud, standing at the channel line the following cold morning, his face showed no pity at all, only a steady kind of attention that settled her more than sympathy ever could have. Then they'd start today, was all he put in, and he picked up a shovel before she could reply. They worked through the worst of that January cold that got down into the bones by mid-morning and refused to let go again until a body stood close enough to a fire to smell its own coat. Levi walked the channels with nothing more than a plain stick from the woodpile, probing the ground the careful way a doctor reads a patient, kneeling here and there to look closer before rising and walking on. What Cora noticed was not only that he worked hard, she had known plenty of men who worked hard and precious few worth admiring for it, but that he explained every single decision out loud as he made it, mostly to Sam, in a way that somehow included her too, as though her own understanding of the land mattered to him as much as the boys did. He showed Sam how to test packed clay for hidden air pockets, how to tell when a section of channel was genuinely finished, rather than merely finished looking to an untrained eye. Cora had managed cattle and books and difficult neighbors and every hard season for 2 years running entirely alone, and yet there were things about the land itself, the plain physical way water actually wanted to move through it, that nobody had ever once thought to teach her. She found herself standing at the channel's edge in that bitter cold, simply listening. Garrett Voss rode onto Willow-Bend on the 4th day. Mounted on a big sorrel, he kept better fed than most of the men who worked under him. He was the largest landowner in the county and had been for longer than Cora's whole marriage, and he had spent years making quiet, patient offers on every neighboring spread the moment trouble showed its face. "Cold morning to be working outside, Mrs. Hale," he commented, his gaze sliding past her toward Levi and Sam at the channel. He'd heard about the bank notice. He mentioned and thought it a shame. A fine piece of land, run by a fine man before her, and he'd like to renew his old offer. $650 and a full month to settle her affairs, which was well over what any bank would recover at auction. She wasn't selling, Cora made plain, evenly. Her water problem was already being solved. Her cattle would carry grazing weight by spring, and she had 30 days to prove exactly that to the bank without his help. Voss studied Levi a long moment the way a man studies a fence he plans to test again later, and rode out without so much as tipping his hat. "That's not generosity," Levi commented once the gate had swung shut behind him. "That's a man who's already decided what something is worth, and is hoping you haven't worked it out yet yourself." She knew that plainly enough. Already. He allowed after a beat that he reckoned she did. 3 weeks into the work, a breeding mare went down hard before dawn. The foal turned wrong inside her, and Cora worked with her whole arm buried in the animal, to the shoulder, while Levi knelt at the mare's head, talking her steady and low the way a person talks to something frightened in the dark. Sam stood frozen in the barn doorway, too scared to ask the question plain on his face. Not if she could help it, was the whole of what Cora gave him without lifting her eyes from the work. The foal came alive 40 minutes later, wet and blinking in the lamplight, and the sound Sam made in that doorway was the nearest thing to a real laugh Cora had heard out of the boy yet. Her own laugh afterward, sitting back exhausted in a ruined dress in the straw, was the first one she had let out in that barn since Daniel died, and Levi looked at her across the mare's neck as though he were seeing something on this ranch he hadn't expected to find when he'd only meant to trade a day's labor for milk. Voss's foreman and 3 of his hands were spotted along the north ridge more than once that month, watching the ranch through field glasses from a distance that was never quite close enough to explain plainly. Levi rode up to look after the second sighting, and came back with a flat, careful expression, saying only that whoever camped up there had a clear line of sight straight down onto the whole east pasture, and that this had stopped being simple trespassing days ago. It stopped being anything so simple entirely on a night in February when Cora and Levi came home from checking the herd to find 3 sections of east fence cut clean through with wire cutters, not broken, not rusted, and 19 head of cattle scattered north into the dark. Levi took the good horse and the rifle and rode out after them alone, over Cora's short argument, on the plain grounds that he knew that stretch of ground better than anyone chasing stolen stock would expect. He came back past midnight with 16 of the 19 head walking in front of him, soaked through from a creek crossing, and dropped into a chair at Cora's table, too tired even to reach for the coffee she set in front of him before he'd sat down. Somebody had camped the ridge on a schedule. He let her know once he'd caught his breath, watching the herd like men getting paid to know exactly when the fence would be easiest to cut. That was not a neighbor's mischief. That was a plan. The night before the bank deadline, Cora sat down with her ledger, and Levi sat across from her, and for the first time since Daniel, she went through every single number in that book, out loud with another living soul in the room. The south pasture water was fixed, the cattle were gaining steadily. The figures were not good. But they were no longer catastrophic, except that projections, Levi pointed out quietly, were only stories to a banker, and a banker dealt strictly in collateral, not in stories. What would a working foreman actually earn on a ranch this size, he wanted to know. Because if his own name went onto her books as foreman, with a formal wage, that was a committed cost. Plainly, but it was also proof laid out in black ink that Willow-Bend was a going operation under real management, not simply a widow scraping by alone. She'd need him to stay on, well past the season, Cora pointed out. He already knew that, he granted. Wren had stopped waking up crying in the night, hadn't done it once since before her mother died, and he wasn't in any hurry to drag her away from the one place that had given her that back. Cora opened the ledger to a clean page and wrote his name down in the same careful hand she used for everything that truly mattered. Levi Dawson, foreman, Willow-Bend Ranch, engaged as of that date, wages as agreed, room and board included. She turned the book around to face him. That was the first time he'd been entered onto anyone's books since Mara died, he allowed quietly. Well, now he was on hers. The bank meeting down in Fort Lyle went sideways before it ever went anywhere useful. Banker Silas Kern studied Cora's ledger, the irrigation cost figures, the cattle weight records, and the one-page operational summary she'd written out plainly in her own hand, and he granted the numbers looked genuinely strong, right up until he slid a single document across his desk that turned Cora's stomach cold. A lien, filed only 6 days earlier, claiming Daniel had left an unpaid feed account of $420 against Voss Supply. Filed, Cora pointed out aloud, exactly 6 days after she'd reported Voss's foreman for packing her drainage channel with rock and soil, a piece of sabotage Levi had caught, sketched, and dated that same afternoon, well before either of them had touched a single stone of it. Levi wanted to know plainly just how much of this bank Garrett Voss personally held the stake in. Kern allowed that wasn't a relevant question. It was, Levi pointed out, the only relevant question left in that whole room, because if Voss held financial interest in the very institution reviewing her loan, then this had stopped being an honest bank meeting and become a coordinated scheme, and that was a matter squarely for the territorial banking commissioner. Kern went very still behind his desk and signed a 90-day extension before either of them left his office. Voss found them anyway out on the boardwalk, as though he'd already known exactly where to stand and wait. Paper could be mistaken, he ventured mildly, when Cora made it plain that Daniel had never once carried a feed debt with his company, and that every receipt in her possession would prove it in open court. So could a man's judgment about what a woman actually knew, she countered, and walked on toward the wagon without waiting to hear his reply. Find out who that drifter really is, she heard him tell his foreman as she passed. Everything about him. What came back to them within days mattered more than either had expected. A letter arrived from Larkspur County. A neighbor there named Ruth Calloway had finally come forward with what she'd always privately known, that the barn fire Levi had been wrongly blamed for years before had actually been set by the very man who'd accused him, and that the county clerk had struck the false record from the books for good. Levi stood at the kitchen window a long while before he could speak at all. It should have been that way from the very start, he finally allowed. It should have, Cora agreed quietly. Whatever leverage Voss had hoped to hold over the quiet stranger working her land was gone in a single afternoon, and something in Levi's shoulders loosened that had plainly been locked tight there for the better part of a year. Cora rode for a lawyer within the week, a careful, fast-moving man named Marion Teague, and he read through Daniel's receipt book, kept 20 years hidden in the barn wall, Levi's dated drawing of the sabotage channel, and Ruth Calloway's sworn letter, and made it flatly clear. It was fraud, coordinated plainly between a land baron and a bank officer, and it belonged squarely in territorial court. Voss's own attorney countered with an emergency motion to place Willow-Bend into provisional receivership before the fraud hearing could even be scheduled, a pure pressure tactic filed on the very morning Cora and Teague were due in Fort Lyle to file their own case. Teague filed the counter-motion at 4:57 in the afternoon, 3 minutes before the courthouse doors closed for good. That timing was the entire point, he pointed out to her afterward on the courthouse steps. They'd wanted her scrambling. They had simply been faster. The fraud hearing fell on a Thursday, and Cora wore the dark dress she had worn once before to Daniel's funeral, because it was her best, and she'd decided plainly that this day deserved it. The sitting judge read a special writ from the Territorial Supreme Court at his own bench that very morning, proof Teague had uncovered that the judge had partially accepted a renovation contract from Voss Supply, a plain conflict no honest court could overlook, and recused himself without another word to the gallery. A circuit judge named Adeline Marsh took the bench inside the hour, read every document Teague handed up to her for the better part of that hour without a single pause, and dismantled Voss's attorney's arguments inside of minutes. The notation in the county deed record, she pointed out plainly, was written in a different ink and a different hand entirely than the document surrounding it. The lien itself claimed a debt already documented as paid in full, co-signed by the very bank officer who later presented that same debt as outstanding. She was ruling fraud, plain and unhurried, and referring the underlying conduct straight to the Territorial Attorney General. She looked directly at Garrett Voss across that courtroom and made it clear she would strongly advise he make himself available to federal investigators without delay. He buttoned his coat and walked straight out, and at the courthouse door a federal marshal stepped forward and pressed an envelope into his hand, the whole exchange visible to Cora from clear across the room. She had done this, Teague let her know quietly once it was over. She'd only filed the paperwork, she pointed out. He'd built the entire case, Teague countered, and meant it. Cora did not feel triumph, exactly standing there in that emptying courtroom. What she felt instead was the particular exhaustion of someone who has fought so long and hard that the sudden silence afterward feels strange, like a familiar sound you'd grown used to that has finally simply stopped. Levi stood beside her the whole while and had nothing at all to say, which turned out to be precisely what she needed from him. Spring came to Willow-Bend the way it always had, without asking anybody's permission first. The repaired channels ran true and clean, the south pasture greened up thick and steady underfoot, and the cattle that had spent all of February on higher ground came down to good grass without any ceremony at all, the way the very best recoveries tend to happen. Quietly, neighbors began finding their way to Cora's kitchen table that spring, wanting to know plainly how a widow had beaten both a bank and a land baron, and she shared with each of them everything without a shred of vanity, leaving nothing hard out of the telling: the ledger, the survey map, the dated record of every act of sabotage, the lawyer, the whole documented truth of it. A woman named Winnie Hargrove, who ran the only other woman-held spread in the county, brought her own troubles to that same table the following week, a timber claim dispute on her east boundary that looked, the more Cora studied it, exactly like the opening moves of the same old game. And Cora sat with her half the afternoon building the same kind of record. The Commercial Association down in Fort Lyle voted Garrett Voss out entirely within the month, unanimous, and word came later that Silas Kern had resigned his post at the bank and handed federal investigators 4 years of his own ledgers without a fight left in him. Federal charges followed Voss clear into territorial court, a fight that would drag on for years in a room that was no longer any concern of hers at all. Sam had stopped studying Cora's boots by then and started following Levi around the north pasture with a stick of his own, probing the ground the exact way he'd been taught, narrating the state of the channels to anyone who'd listened the way his father once had. Wren, old enough now to walk the whole distance from the barn to the porch on her own 2 legs, had taken to calling the ranch simply home, without qualification. The way a child says a word only once, it is finally settled into the right place for good. It was Levi who finally put plain words to the thing. Neither of them had quite named, yet standing at the kitchen window, one warm evening with the whole ranch gone green and quiet beyond it. He'd like to stay, he let her know, not simply through to the end of the foreman's contract, but past it, for good. Cora considered that a long moment before she gave her answer. She had been alone on this land 2 whole years. She had managed. She would have kept right on managing. But she didn't want to anymore, and that was an entirely different thing from not being able to. Something in his face finally came loose at that. The particular relief of a man who has reached the far end of a hard road and found something waiting there he had long since stopped letting himself hope for. That would do, was all he gave back to her. Willow-Bend did not survive that hard winter because the land got lucky, and it did not survive because a stranger rode in one January afternoon to rescue it. It survived because the woman who owned it looked at every single soul who assured her plainly that it was already lost and decided out loud and without apology that every one of them was wrong, and then did the patient work required to prove it, ledger page by ledger page, until an entire valley that had quietly bet against her had no honest choice left but to owe her the plain truth of what she'd built. Willow-Bend stayed hers, the deed, the name on the gate, the land itself, all of it, and what she and Levi Dawson built together on it afterward was never a rescue at all. It was a partnership earned the plain, hard, honest way, one cold morning at a time. If a story like theirs is the kind that settles you in for the whole ride, there are plenty more waiting for you, complete from the very first hoofbeat clear through to the last, here on the Cowgirl Chronicles. Come sit by the fire a while longer before you go on your way. I'll leave the gate open for you, and that fire's not going anywhere.